Hi, my name is Brody Sandel, and I'm an associate professor in the biology department at Santa Clara University. In our lab, we study how ecosystems and biodiversity responds to global change using a combination of field methods and big data computational methods. I'm talking with you today a little bit about some of our research we do on large data sets, trying to understand how biodiversity has responded to climate change in the past. Now, we all know that climate is expected to change quite a bit in the coming centuries, and the rate of change that we expect in that time is largely unprecedented in Earth's recent history. But there have certainly been very large changes in climate in the past. For example, during the ice ages and the warming out of those ice ages, Earth has experienced dramatic shifts in climate, and those have been cyclical, and there have been many of these ice ages over the last million years. So we ask how those major climate changes that have occurred in the past have shaped the biodiversity that we see today, with the idea that understanding how those past changes have shaped the patterns we see today, maybe that understanding can help us understand what to expect in the coming centuries. So one of the tools we use to do this is a measure of the rate of climate change called climate change velocity. And the idea is that traditionally we measure the rate of climate change as the rate of change through time. For example, we might say that in California it's been warming half a degree per decade, or something like that. And that's a good description of how conditions are changing at a location. But for many organisms, they're not going to sit still to experience that change. They're going to move in response to climate change. And so climate change reframes, I guess I should say, the rate of climate change in terms that are intended to be more biologically relevant. And so the way we do it is we don't compute just the rate of change through time, but the rate of movement of a given climate condition over the Earth's surface. So, for example, if it's the mean annual temperature at some location is 10 degrees, and then climate warms, now the mean annual temperature here won't be 10 degrees anymore, but that new 10 degrees will be somewhere off in the distance, right? Maybe it moved up a mountain, or maybe it moved towards the pole. How far did it move, right? That rate of movement through time tells us how fast plants, animals, everything needs to move in order to stay in the climate conditions that it prefers. So we think this measure of climate change velocity is a really useful tool to describe climate change in units that are very meaningful for organisms. Now, we've computed climate change velocity from the last glacial maximum, that's about 21,000 years ago, to the present, and shown that the rates are hugely variable across the Earth. So we have, for example, in the Andes Mountains, where the climate has been very stable, and the terrain is very complex, which means that a small movement will be enough to offset a large change in climate. In those situations, climate change velocities can be as low as 1 centimeter per year. On the other hand, in northeastern Canada, where the terrain is relatively flat, and the climate change, the magnitude of the increase in temperature from the last glacial maximum to the present has been extreme, the rates of the climate change velocities there have been something like 170 meters per year. So that tells us that an organism living in that environment would have to move its population 170 meters every year in order to stay in a particular climate condition. So we've taken that measure of climate change velocity and used it to ask many questions about how ancient climate changes may be shaping biodiversity. And I'll tell you briefly about one of the results coming from a recent paper with a SCU undergrad. We were interested in understanding patterns in bird communities and where we find hotspots of what's called phylogenetic endemism. And phylogenetic endemism describes the degree to which a bird community contains many phylogenetically unique and small-ranged species. So these are areas where the bird community has particular conservation value because they represent very unusual phylogenetic lineages and very geographically rare species. And there are many things that we think might influence phylogenetic endemism patterns. For example, current climate, human land use, topography, that kind of thing. And what we found in this paper is that all of those things do matter as we expect, But the climate change velocity is also very important, and we only find high phylogenetic endemism of birds in conditions where the climate has been relatively stable since the last glacial maximum. And that matches well with results we've seen in other groups, like mammals and amphibians, at different spatial scales. So that's one example of how we're using climate change velocity to understand patterns in biodiversity today and try to understand something about what we might expect with future climate change. Future work in the lab is continuing to pursue these large big data computational approaches and fuse them increasingly with our own field collections to understand how particularly plants will respond to climate change in the future.